Global corporations did not rise because the world suddenly embraced efficiency or innovation. They rose because power, capital, and coordination learned how to cross borders faster than politics. Culture and law could contain them. When I trace the ascent of multinational corporations, I do not begin in Silicon Valley boardrooms or post-war trade agreements, but much earlier in the slow realization that scale itself could become a decisive economic weapon. Empires once ruled through flags and armies. Global corporations would rule through balance sheets, supply chains, and contracts, achieving reach without formal conquest and influence without direct sovereignty. The earliest ancestors of modern multinationals were the chartered companies of the early modern era, entities like the Dutch VOC and the British East India Company, which I have spoken of before, not as historical curiosities, but as prototypes. These organizations demonstrated that when capital is pooled, risk is socialized among investors, and political privilege is granted by the state, a corporation can operate across oceans and generations. What made them revolutionary was not trade itself, but permanence. Unlike merchants who lived and died, these corporations endured accumulated institutional memory and learned to negotiate, coerce, and adapt at a scale individuals never could. The idea that an artificial legal person could outlive kings was quietly radical, yet those early corporate empires were still bound tightly to state power. Their charters were explicit, their monopolies granted, their violence sanctioned. The modern multinational would emerge only when corporations learned to detach themselves from direct political control while continuing to benefit from political order. This shift began in earnest in the 19th century, as industrialization transformed production and transportation. Railways, steamships, and the telegraph collapsed distance. A firm could now coordinate operations across continents in something approaching real time. Capital followed this possibility instinctively. If raw materials could be sourced globally and markets served internationally, why remain confined to national borders? The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the first true wave of multinational enterprise. Companies like Standard Oil, Siemens, Nestlé, and Singer established operations abroad, not merely to sell products, but to control supply distribution and pricing across regions. This was vertical integration on a global scale. The motive was not abstract globalization, but control over uncertainty. By owning mines, factories, shipping, and sales networks across countries, firms insulated themselves from local shocks, labor, unrest, and political risk. In doing so, they began to operate above the economic fate of any single nation. 2 world wars interrupted this expansion, but they also accelerated its logic. Wartime production taught corporations how to coordinate massive complex systems under state direction. When peace returned, those capabilities did not vanish. Instead, they were redeployed commercially. The post-World War II order provided fertile ground for multinational growth. The Bretton Woods system stabilized currencies, reduced trade barriers, and encouraged cross-border investment. American corporations in particular surged outward, carrying technology management practices and capital into Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This was not cultural evangelism, it was competitive necessity. To remain dominant, firms had to be everywhere their rivals might go. What distinguishes the post-war multinational from its predecessors is subtle but crucial. It did not rule territories, it arbitraged them. Differences in wages, taxes, regulations, and currencies became strategic inputs. Production could be fragmented with components manufactured in multiple countries before final assembly elsewhere. Profits could be booked where taxes were lowest. Legal structures could be optimized across jurisdictions. The multinational learned to treat the world not as a map of nations, but as a mosaic of costs and advantages. Sovereignty became something to navigate rather than submit to. By the late 20th century, This model had matured into what we now call global supply chains. Corporations no longer simply operated abroad. They orchestrated entire networks of suppliers, contractors, and logistics providers spanning dozens of countries. This arrangement delivered remarkable efficiency and lowered prices worldwide. Consumers benefited. Profits soared. But history reminds us that efficiency achieved through dispersion also creates fragility. When production is stretched across borders, disruption anywhere reverberates everywhere. The very structure that empowered global corporations also made the global economy more interdependent and less resilient. Alongside economic power came political influence. Multinationals became major employers, taxpayers, and investors, giving them leverage over policy. Governments courted them with incentives, fearing capital flight. Regulation became a competitive variable. This dynamic did not require corruption. It arose naturally from asymmetry. When a corporation can move and a government cannot, bargaining power shifts. The corporation does not need to govern. It only needs to be indispensable. This is how private entities acquired public influence without public accountability. What fascinates me most is how normalized this transformation became. The rise of global corporations was framed as inevitability, as progress, as the natural outcome of technology and markets. Yet history shows that it was shaped by choices, trade agreements, financial liberalization, legal protections for capital, and political tolerance for concentration. Multinationals did not replace the state, but they learned to operate in the space between states, benefiting from order without fully belonging to any single polity. This ambiguity is their greatest strength and their greatest source of tension. As we stand today amid debates about supply chain security, corporate power, inequality, and national sovereignty, it becomes clear that the rise of global corporations is not a completed story, but an ongoing negotiation. The same forces that lifted them to dominance are now exposing their limits. Efficiency is colliding with resilience. Global reach is confronting local responsibility. And the question history keeps asking without yet answering is whether economic power that transcends borders can ever be fully reconciled with political systems that do not, or whether this imbalance will define the next era of instability as the age of the multinational enters a phase not of expansion, but of reckoning, where the world must decide how much authority it is willing to leave in hands that answer to shareholders rather than citizens. And the story moves forward into a reckoning that history suggests was always inevitable, because economic power that floats above borders eventually collides with societies that remain rooted within them. As the 21st century unfolds, the multinational corporation finds itself facing constraints it once believed it had outgrown. The very strategies that fueled its rise, global dispersion, regulatory arbitrage, just-in-time efficiency, are now sources of vulnerability. Pandemics, geopolitical conflict, technological rivalry, and climate disruption have exposed how brittle global coordination can be when trust erodes and politics reasserts itself. What once looked like seamless globalization now appears as a web of dependencies no one fully controls. States long assumed to be in retreat have begun to push back. Industrial policy has returned under new names. Strategic sectors are redefined. Supply chains are shortened, duplicated, or brought home not because it is cheaper, but because it is safer. This is not the end of multinational corporations, but it is a shift in the terms under which they operate. Governments are no longer content to be passive hosts, competing for investment at any cost. They are rediscovering an old truth: resilience. Not efficiency becomes the priority when systems are stressed, and resilience demands oversight, redundancy, and sometimes sacrifice of profit. For global corporations, this moment feels unfamiliar. For decades, scale insulated them from accountability. Complexity shielded them from scrutiny. But history teaches us that legitimacy matters as much as profitability. When corporations grow too powerful relative to the societies they depend on, they attract not admiration, but suspicion. Antitrust resurfaces. Tax coordination becomes politically urgent. Questions once dismissed as ideological about fairness, concentration, and responsibility return with force because they are rooted in lived experience of inequality and insecurity. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine a simple reversal. Multinationals are not relics waiting to be dismantled. They are adaptive institutions forged by centuries of evolution. They will adjust, localize where necessary, and reframe their role. Some will fragment. Others will deepen integration with states, becoming partners in national strategies rather than free-floating entities. This hybridization mirrors earlier eras when corporations learned to survive by aligning more closely with political power. The form changes, the negotiation continues. What history makes clear is that the rise of global corporations was never just about commerce. It was about governance. When firms coordinate labor capital and technology across borders, they perform functions once reserved for states. The unresolved question is not whether they should exist, but how their power should be balanced. Left unchecked, concentration breeds fragility. Over-constrained innovation stalls. The equilibrium is always temporary. For investors, citizens, and policymakers, the lesson of this long arc is sobering but clarifying. Global corporations are neither villains nor saviors. They are products of incentives created by law, technology, and political choice. If those incentives reward extraction without responsibility, that is what corporations will deliver. If they reward long-term stewardship, resilience, and alignment with social goals, corporate behavior will follow. History does not absolve institutions. It reflects the structures that shape them. As the world navigates fragmentation, strategic rivalry, and systemic risk, the multinational enters its next chapter not as an unstoppable force, but as a contested one. Its future will be shaped not by inevitability, but by decisions about taxation, regulation, labor, and sovereignty that echo earlier turning points in financial history. Those who understand where global corporations came from are better equipped to judge where they can and should go next. If this exploration of the rise of global corporations has deepened your understanding of power in the modern economy, I invite you to subscribe and continue these historical journeys with me, and to leave a comment sharing whether you believe the age of the multinational is adapting, fragmenting, or approaching its limits. Because history shows that every structure that seems permanent is merely waiting for the moment when conditions force it to change.